Okay, welcome. My name is Pete Betke. I'm a professor of economics here at George Mason University and the director of the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center. And this is a PPE book sort of workshop for Chris Coyne's new book. We're here. It's the title up there that you can see. And so I want to thank you all for taking the time to come on out. The way this is going to work today is we're going to get Chris to come on up and give a discussion summary of his main findings in his book. And then we're going to have discussants. Peter Van der Buren will talk first. Then Bob Higgs will talk. And then Chris, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I'm going to try to give very brief introductions. Before that, I want to thank the staff at Mercatus and Claire for putting this all together and making us be able to do events like this. Peter Van der Buren is a 24-year veteran of Foreign Service Office at the State Department. Spent a year in Iraq leading 2 State Department provisional reconstruction teams. Following his book, We Met Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People, published in 2011, the Department of State began termination proceedings against him, reassigning him to make-work position and stripping him of his security clearance and diplomatic credentials. Through the efforts of the Government Accountability Project and the ACLU, Van Buren instead retired from the State Department with full benefits of service. Then we'll hear from Professor Bob Higgs. Bob Higgs is a senior fellow in political economy for the Independent Institute and the editor-at-large of the Institute's quarterly journal, The Independent Review. He received his PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University, and he has taught at the University of Washington, Lafayette College, Seattle University, and the University of Economics in Prague. He has been a visiting scholar at Oxford and Stanford and a fellow at the Hoover Institution and the National Science Foundation. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Gary, I don't know how to say this, I should know this because it's actually a Mises Institute thing, I think, Scharlbaum Award for Lifetime Defense of Liberty, the Thomas Saz Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Cause of Civil Liberties, Lysander Spooner Award for Advancing the Literature of Liberty, and the Friedrich Wieser Memorial Prize for Excellence in Economic Education, and Templeton Honor Rolls Awards on education in a free society. And finally, our author today, Chris Coyne, is the F.A. Harper Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He's the Associate Director of the Hayek Program, and he is also the Director of Graduate Studies at George Mason University's Economics Department. He is a co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and co-editor of the Independent Review and the book review editor of Public Choice. In 2008, he was named a Hayek Fellow at the London School of Economics, and in 2010, he was a visiting scholar at Social Philosophy and Policy Center at Bowling Green. We're here today to talk about Chris's most recent book, but before that, he published After War, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy, also by Stanford, Media Development and Institutional Change, co-authored with Pete Leeson. It was published in 2009, and he's the editor with Rachel Coyne of the Handbook of the Political Economy of War. In addition, he's published numerous articles in books and journals and in policy things. So without any further ado from me, please welcome Chris Coyne.
Thank you all very much for coming out, and thanks to Peter and Bob for taking the time to come and comment, and to Claire and Erica for setting this all up. So I have about 20 minutes, and what I'm going to do in that time is provide a very brief overview of some of the key themes and arguments in the book, and we can touch upon more of them in the Q&A if you'd like. So to begin, what I want to do is highlight the 4 main lessons, or what I see as the 4 main lessons of the book. Ultimately, issues of humanitarianism, and I'll define that momentarily, are ultimately economic issues, and more specifically, issues of economic development. More developed countries are more insulated from the adverse effects of things like natural disasters. They have private property rights that protect most, if not all, citizens against human rights violations, and so on. Number 2, aid and assistance from external governments is unable to promote societal economic development. So outside governments are unable to accomplish number one. Number three, short-term humanitarian assistance can, in principle, provide short-term relief. In other words, for people that are suffering in other geographic locations, other societies, it is in principle possible to help them with short-term relief, even though, as I'll discuss in more detail momentarily in the book, I argue that we shouldn't have confidence in government's ability to do this on a consistent basis across instances of suffering. And finally, economic freedom is the best means to achieve the ends of raising standards of living. In other words, economic freedom is able to accomplish what foreign aid cannot. It can facilitate development, which is the most effective means of minimizing human suffering. So let me talk about some of these lessons or provide some background on how I arrive at them. In the book, this book started, I was thinking about humanitarian aid and short-term assistance only. And the reason I got on this is because in my first book I talked about nation building and military occupation. And many, if not most people, disagreed with my position in that book. But one of the things or questions I would get asked all the time is, well, even if we do buy your argument, what about, and then the person would insert some kind of humanitarian crisis, a genocide, a famine, and they'd say, well, surely you think that there's a role for foreign governments to play to help these people who are suffering. And so that was kind of the impetus behind doing bad. And as I started looking into how humanitarian action is defined, I realized that the time frame is a purely categorical or definitional issue. In other words, development economists differentiate between short-term aid and long-term aid, but really both are intended to alleviate human suffering. It's true the time frame is different. In some instances, you hand someone a bottle of water, that's immediate relief. In other instances, you build roads and infrastructure and schools and so on, and that might be categorized as long-term development aid. But in both instances, it's intended to facilitate improvements in standards of living which minimize human suffering. So I take a very broad definition, and the way I view humanitarian action, state-led humanitarian action, is any coercive or non-coercive action that is intended to alleviate suffering. So some examples domestically. Hurricane Katrina is a non-coercive example of government attempts to alleviate suffering. Extreme poverty around the world, foreign aid intended to alleviate poverty. That's an example of humanitarian action under my definition. Post-earthquake Haiti, following the 2010 earthquake, it's still ongoing. That's an example. And Libya, that's an example of coercive humanitarian action. The U.S. government was not invited in by the government of Libya, but they intervened to, in at least principle, to bring about improved humanitarian conditions. You can think of many other examples, but I wanted to kind of point out that I take a very broad view of what this includes. Now, here's the thing. If you look at most discussions of this, you will see that typically you hear something like this. We must do something to help people who are suffering. We have to help them, and there's a moral imperative to do so. And I don't want to deny that there may or may not be a moral imperative. I don't want to engage in that conversation. What I want to point out is that in focusing on the ought, do we have a moral obligation to help those who are suffering? Oftentimes what is overlooked is what can we accomplish, what actually can be done. And this is crucially important, as I argue in the opening pages of the book, because things that might appear at first to have moral weight and a moral obligation might have much less of a weight once you take into account the constraints you face. In other words, once you take into account the various limits on what you can actually accomplish, you might determine that intervening is not the best course of action. The other reason I picked these quotes is because they're all politicians. And I don't have time to go into it today, but in the book I spend a chapter talking about how the state has become more and more involved over time in humanitarian action, especially since the world wars, but even before that, and across the board, from everything from military interventions to short-term relief to long-term development relief to contracting and subsuming NGOs and the budgets of those supposedly private organizations and so on. So that's why in the book I focus on state-led humanitarian action. But what I really want to focus on, and kind of the central question of the book, is can governments systematically provide assistance to those in need? Typically discussions of humanitarian action do one of two things. They cherry pick, so each side can pick cases that worked or didn't work. Of course, if you like intervention with military occupation, what's the first thing? Japan and Germany following World War II. That worked, therefore we can do X, is the argument that you often hear. But of course, I can just flip that around and say, well, X, Y, and Z didn't work. And then that's what the debate falls back and forth on. even though when you move to large-scale statistical studies, there's disagreement about what foreign aid can do. For those familiar with development economics, just think, for instance, of Jeff Sachs and Bill Easterly, two very respected scholars who are viewing the same evidence but view it very differently, the implications of that. So really the question we want to ask is, can government systematically provide aid to those in need? And in order to do this, I think it's very important to look at economic theory and the insights from the economic way of thinking. So let me briefly discuss what I argue are the limits of humanitarian action. One of the themes throughout the book is, let's start by not saying what should we do, but what can we do. In order to understand the can, we need to first delineate the limits of what actually can be accomplished in practice. And what I want to start by talking about is this idea of what can aid accomplish? What can it do? And this is one of the most confused and conflated discussions in development economics and politics by policymakers and pundits. And they conflate two things. They conflate increasing outputs with economic development. So if you pick up a development report from Oxfam or from any international organization that claims to be helping those in need, and you flip to their successes, it'll say things like enrolled X amount of children in school, built X number of hospitals, or something along these lines. And they count those as successes in facilitating development in the name of removing human suffering. Now, it's true that those things are increases in output, but that does not necessarily mean that they are contributing to broader society-wide economic development. And here's the distinction, the important distinction between these two things. Increases in societal development, well-being, standards of living in a general sense, do involve increases in output, but they entail increases in output of things that people value. In other words, there is a link between production and consumption. Increased output just entails increased production. But if it's not producing things that people value, it's irrelevant for development. It doesn't improve the standard of living of the average citizen. So then what is required to solve the core economic problem, which, by the way, we teach our students in principles. We point out this idea of the core economic problem that we're facing. Well, for this, we can turn to Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, who, of course, engaged in the famous calculation debate and discussed under what conditions individuals are able to engage in what they called rational economic calculation. As Hayek points out in his famous 1945 article, the relevant information that's necessary to allocate resources to their highest valued use is not given, but must be continually rediscovered. And the Mises-Hayek position was that that can only be discovered under a context of property, markets, and profit and loss. So why is this important? Well, I can first summarize this in one cartoon, which I like, if you're going to remember one thing about this. This is a famous cartoon from the Soviet days, and there's, I don't know if you can read that in the back, so I'll read it. It's a 1-ton nail, and the worker at the factory is asking the plant manager, who needs a nail as big as that? And the plant manager says, who cares? The important thing is we fulfilled the plan for nails in one fell swoop. This is an increase in output. GDP has been boosted. It's irrelevant for actual development. Citizens are not made better off by this. And of course, this was the problem with the Soviet economy in general. And economists fell prey to this, of course. Right? They kept saying that the Soviet economy is doing quite well. And then there were some individuals, Warren Nutter, Paul Craig Roberts, Rothbard, and Man, Economy, and State, pointed out that, well, interestingly, all of the investments that are being taken by the Soviet government in things like military, infrastructure, capital goods, and the average well-being of citizens is not increasing. Why is that? Well, it's because of the calculation problem. Now, here's what you need to think about, and this is why this is important. When you think about state-led humanitarian action, what's the comparison? Are they closer to what Mises and Hayek pointed out in terms of what's required for development, the conditions for rational economic calculation, or are they closer to a centrally planned economy? And as it turns out, a very brief, or if you want to delve into it, you'll see it even more, a very brief review shows that it is akin to central planning. And when you start looking in these terms, you see 1-ton nails all around you. When you start just looking through the lens of economics. Two very brief examples. Following Hurricane Katrina, this is the infamous trailer example, right, where FEMA purchased all these trailers. They ended up being useless and sitting there, and they increased output. The output of housing increased, but it did not contribute to alleviating the suffering of those who have incurred the cost of the hurricane. A more recent example, Afghanistan. This is from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which reported that 97% of Afghanistan's GDP is due to injections from external aid. So now, of course, the argument is, well, we can't really disengage from Afghanistan because if we do, the economy will collapse. This is not economic development in the sense of entrepreneurship, innovation that increases standards of living. It's fake. It's parachuting in goods and services from the outside, which again might help some people, but it doesn't lead to any kind of long-term development in the sense that economists talk about it. So now here's the thing. That's the limits of what aid can do. Aid cannot promote society-wide development. What it can do, in principle, is increase increase outputs which alleviate short-term suffering. But now we have a puzzle to explain. And there's two aspects of the puzzle. The first is that in many cases of delivering aid, understand that delivering short-term aid is a purely technological problem. We know how to produce water. We know how to produce vaccines. It's simply a matter of moving it from point A to point B. But we know from experience that in numerous instances, it never gets from point A to point B. That's part of the puzzle. The second puzzle is why is there a constant push within state agencies, bureaus, to push beyond those limits, to go beyond what can be accomplished. And really the main takeaway here is that in the absence of economic knowledge, in the absence or the inability of the ability of planners to engage in economic calculation, what they do is turn to political knowledge. And that political knowledge is generated through political institutions, which generates a variety of perverse outcomes. And one of the themes throughout the book that I discuss, the main character, if you will, kind of going off Adam Smith's man of the system, is what I call the man of the humanitarian system. And just like Adam Smith's man of the system, the man of the humanitarian system thinks or has the mentality that they can move people around in a manner which makes them better off because the man of the system has superior knowledge. Smith likens it to moving people around on a chessboard. And of course, as he says, they assume that the pawns don't respond. They're completely passive. And so that's when I get into kind of the politics of it. And there's really three aspects that I talk about in the book. I'll briefly talk about each. I can't go into too much detail given the time limitations. And these are well known to those of you who are familiar with the literature on development and foreign aid. The first is that when you provide windfall profits, in other words, when you dump a lot of money into a situation, typically that is dysfunctional to start with. By dysfunctional, I mean it's highly corrupt. There are a lack of checks and balances and mechanisms for accountability and responsibility and feedback. What happens is you generate political competition on a variety of margins. You get competition between potential recipient governments. You get competition between agencies within recipient governments. You get competition at home within the United States and other developed countries, governments. Within those governments, you get competition between the agencies that they vie for control of policy and control of resources. And really what's left out of this formula is the supposed customer. The customer of humanitarian action is ultimately the person that's suffering. But if you look at how the system is set up, they really have no voice. There's no feedback between the person you're attempting to help and the actual source of the funds. And as the hierarchy or the bureaucracy gets more and more layered and more vertical, if you will, taller, I should say, that link is further and further blurred. That leads directly to the concept of, or the economics of bureaucracy. The economics of bureaucracy in the book I pull off from, of course, Gordon Tullock and Bill Niskanen. And one of the things or several of the things they pointed out is that bureaus have an incentive to maximize their budget, maximize the number of subordinates that are employed, and also maximize the array of activities that fall under the purview of their portfolio. And this explains why there is a tendency for government bureaus to push beyond the limits of what can be accomplished. How do you get a bigger budget in government? What sounds better? Saying, well, if you give us more money, we can do a really good job delivering water to people in Haiti. Or, give me more money, we need to go around the world and rid the world of bad people, end extreme poverty, make the world a better place, make it safe for democracy. Of course, the latter sounds much better than just saying, look, we really can just focus on delivering tents, water, and vaccines, so let's focus our efforts on that. And it's that push which encourages this man of the system mentality. It incentivizes it and rewards it. And finally, there's this idea of system effects. System effects refer to the idea that when you intervene in a complex system has two kind of key characteristics. One is there's a united set of elements or units that are interconnected. And the second related characteristic is that the broader order looks different than any of the individual units or elements. So the individual units or elements are interconnected, but they generate a broader order that has its own unique characteristics. Systems type thinking, if you appreciate it, limits your ability to intervene in the system to fix perceived problems, because you quickly realize that it's beyond human reason to understand that system, let alone design a plan that can neatly fix it. The type of thinking that dominates state-led humanitarian action is linear thinking. Linear thinking is engineering or technological type thinking. It's A plus B equals C. This type of thinking is good for lots of things. For building bridges, it's good. For accomplishing tasks that we can comprehend, linear thinking is quite important. For redesigning the world according to our grand plans and desires, it's not very good because we can't hope to understand it. But more importantly, in intervening in one aspect of the system, it has effects which you can't possibly anticipate. It has effects which are not seen at the time of action. But more importantly, given the inefficiencies of political institutions, which are highly unadaptable, relevant adjustments will not be made once those adverse effects become evident over time. And you can identify lots of different cases of this. One case of a system's effects, which is going on right now, is Libya. So on the face of it, you overthrow Gaddafi. Terrible dictator, violator of human rights. You can't argue that in any way that he was a good guy. What happens? Overthrow him. People of limited intervention say, see, they work. Well, what's the outcome? It's true that Gaddafi's gone, but you have disorder within the country, a power vacuum with no clear, strong, centralized power. You have militias running around, but more importantly, you have regional instability now, which of course led to the French intervention in Mali, which then is spilling over. Weapons are then spilling over into Syria now, and so on. This, by the way, is not an argument against intervention in itself, the point that there's unintended consequences. What it is a word of warning that what at first appears to be a simple intervention to correct something, when you take into account what could happen and limits on your knowledge, the net benefits are not as clear as they first appear. And at least you should recognize that and have a discussion. And the burden, the onus is on the person who is the proponent of the intervention to demonstrate that when these negative unintended consequences do emerge, mechanisms are in place that will lead people to adapt and change their behaviors appropriately. So, where does this leave us? At the end of the book, what I come back and do is say, I want to rethink state-led humanitarian action. So you have the man of the system. In the words of Thomas Sowell, you have an unconstrained vision of what humanitarians can accomplish. And really what I come back at the end and say is what we need is not a mentality of being unconstrained, but a constrained approach. And what would that entail? Well, let's say our end is to help people, and we realize the constraints we face, the ones I pointed out earlier. Really what we want to do is shift discovery from, I know what it takes to develop a country, I can design it and implement it as I see fit, to the recognition that development is a discovery process that takes place within certain institutional environments. So what this ultimately entails then is getting those institutional environments. But here's the problem. As I've argued in my other book, establishing the institutional environments in other countries through gunpoint and occupation is quite difficult to do. So where does that leave us? Well, the argument I make in this book is that instead of the outward focus, we need to go over there and fix them. Let's focus inward. Let's focus on our own society and say, what can we do to help people in need? And I make two arguments. Well, I'll focus on one of them. Removing barriers to discovery. I'll put forth the more controversial of them, which is migration. We can look to reform our migration rules, our laws against migration, which I would argue is the best means for alleviating human suffering. Michael Clemens at the Center for Global Development has estimated, it's an estimate, that if we removed global barriers to migration, we would double global GDP. Even if he's off by a large amount, the impact is still enormous in terms of actually improving people's well-beings. Now you might say, that's good for long-term development, but what about immediate short-term humanitarian crises? What do we do after an earthquake? We say, sorry, you can move here, but buildings are falling down. What are we going to do? Well, actually, we have a very good natural experiment of how this can work following the earthquake in Haiti. Following the earthquake in Haiti, there were 200,000 Haitian workers in the United States whose papers expired. And so the US government, being other regarding as it always is, said, we are not going to send you back. We will allow you to stay here and grant you temporary status as a worker here, even though your papers have expired. And according to the World Bank in 2010, those 200,000 workers sent home sent back to Haiti $360 million in remittances. That's more aid, by the way, than the U.S. government gave to Haiti following the earthquake in that same year, which actually might be a good thing that they didn't give more, but nonetheless, private humanitarian action generated more aid than governments could do, which have enormously more money to offer. Imagine what could happen if we allowed more people in to the United States and then allowed them to send money back home to help those in need. By the way, from all OECD donor countries to developing countries, remittances are somewhere in the $170 to $180 billion a year. And to put that in perspective, in 2009, 2010, official development assistance from those same OECD countries was about 135 to 140 billion. So remittances are greater than the amount of aid given by government. So there's no reason to believe that if government wasn't doing this, somehow no one would be offering assistance to those in need. So, pessimism. I am under no delusion at all that what I offer in the book will be listened to by most people, let alone implemented in any way in the short term in terms of policy. And the reason why is for the same reasons I pointed out in terms of public choice problems or political economy problems with the persistence of this system. There's the very incentives for reform are at odds with what I'm suggesting. In other words, there's the incentive to continually expand and push beyond those limits as compared to recognizing that there are limits. In fact, what this encourages is hubris, as I mentioned, the man of the system mentality to continually take on more and more things. And you're seeing that now. If you look at U.S. foreign policy now, what's happened? We've elevated development, defense, and diplomacy, the 3 Ds, and we're integrating them all. So now they're no longer viewed as separate entities, they're all combined. When the military intervenes, they have to have humanitarians with them. As Colin Powell talked about, NGOs are now viewed as force multipliers. They're simply extensions of the military. They're no longer independent, and so on. So I have no strong sense of optimism that this will have an impact in the short run. But I do end the book on an optimistic note, and this is how I'll end, which is if you look at a couple indicators and a couple realities of the world, I think there's reason for optimism for what I'm discussing. One of them is that between 1980 and 2005, average economic freedom on a global level increased at a pretty significant rate. If you look at Andre Schleifer's paper in the Journal of Economic Literature, The Age of Milton Friedman, he discusses this and the gains that were made over that period in terms of removing global barriers to trade and economic activity. Second, as I mentioned, there's a robust private sector, both in terms of remittances, but also in terms of for-profit firms, which are typically poo-pooed by humanitarians because they're viewed as being greedy for-profits. But actually, for-profits are very effective at responding to humanitarian disasters, as we saw in the United States in the wake of Hurricane Katrina with companies like Walmart, Home Depot, and so on. And finally, there is a significantly large global informal economy. The journalist Robert Neuwirth has a book called The Stealth of Nations. He estimates in that book that the global informal economy is about $10 trillion. If that's accurate, it's the 3rd largest economy in the world behind the US and China. And these activities, by the way, are not things that we would consider illegal activities like hitmen and whatnot, or trading people and children. It's economic activity that's driven underground because of excessive regulation and barriers to trade. So from that standpoint, entrepreneurship is all around. It's just a matter of unleashing it. So to sum up and to conclude, my intention in doing bad is to emphasize that when people attempt to transcend economics when dealing with economic issues, perverse and harmful outcomes emerge. Issues of humanitarian action are fundamentally of an economic nature and require economic answers, and ignoring the economics of humanitarianism, which if you think about it, the issues I've discussed are really no more than principles of economics, the core economic way of thinking applied to a very relevant policy issue in a consistent manner. Ignoring that will not invalidate the insights of economics, but what it does do is continue to impose significant costs on those that are already suffering and misses an opportunity to make their lives better off. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we'll hear from Peter Van Buren.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wrote a book, too. It's called We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People. So in case you were not clear who, in fact, lost that war, it was probably me. It's a very important to to talk about what happened in Iraq because I, in fact, was the man in the system that Chris refers to in his book. I was charged by the U.S. Department of State with the rebuilding of Iraq. We like the term rebuilding. Other people said nation building, humanitarian, reconstruction. Pick the buzzword that appeals to you most. It was all pretty much the same thing. And the Department of State sent me to Iraq specifically charged with this mission, to fix this, to rebuild Iraq, and not only alleviate any humanitarian suffering, but along the way create an ally of the United States. And we were given extraordinary amounts of money to do this with. And over the course of my time there, running 2 of the provincial reconstruction teams, the vehicle for all this, we managed to break pretty much every rule that Chris cited in his book. And the results, I think, are fairly obviously a failure. What I'd like to do today, in the brief time that I have, is to go through some of the things that happened in Iraq and relate them to Chris's more academic examples and put a human face on some of the things that he refers to as the perverse outcomes of our efforts there. To begin with, the concept of the man in the system was alive and well in what we did in Iraq. And is certainly at play in our efforts in Afghanistan today and other places around the world where the United States has continued in this object of nation building. In Iraq, we didn't just separate the man in the system kind of theoretically from the environment that he was trying to influence. We actually built walls around him. Most of the decisions about what were being done in Iraq were either being made in Washington, which was far away from Iraq, or they were being made at the American Embassy, which was in the Green Zone in Baghdad, which was surrounded by a moat and walls and barbed wire, and was about as far away from Iraq as you could get and still theoretically claim to be in the country. We used to make a joke among ourselves that, how does the U.S. Embassy keep track of events in Iraq? And the answer was from the roof. And it was actually very true. And the ability to see what was going on was outweighed by the internal desire to believe that you could, in fact, control what was going on by making pronouncements. And so we would often be given directives from Washington, such as, well, the Secretary of Agriculture is going to be making a big speech next week in Iowa, so please create some agricultural successes that he can cite there. Try to get that done by next week. We would also be told that it was now time to begin empowering women, and which is a great idea. But the driver, of course, was that a new ambassador for women's empowerment had been imported into Iraq, and she wanted to have things empowered during her time there. And so the mindset that we could influence these events was very real and very much the man in the humanitarian system that Chris talks about. The other thing that struck me in talking about the motivations, I mean, most of us at some level wanted to do nice things. I mean, the title of my book, We Meant Well, is only partially sarcastic, because I don't think anyone was out there to say, gee, I hope I really mess up somebody's life today, or spill water on somebody, or make a mess out of things. I think we all, internally wanted to do something nice. But in fact, our motivations were very different. We were driven by a desire to please our bosses, because in a bureaucratic system, that is how one gets ahead. We were, of course, driven to create outcomes, such as more students are in school and more bottles of water were delivered, the things that Chris talked about. But more importantly, we wanted to make our boss happy so that she was happy and could make her boss happy, and on up the line until one day Hillary Clinton smiled and all would be well for us. On a 24-hour news cycle, that was really kind of a bit of a challenge to do. It used to be that we had to have a success a week. The bosses would have a big weekly meeting on Fridays in the embassy, and everybody had to feed a success upstream by Friday. And these could be real or imagined, but you had to have something each week in order to get things done. The real problem came when they started to have 2 meetings a week, and then we had to have double as many successes on a regular basis, and that got kind of tricky. Many times these successes devolved into bureaucratic ones that were far removed from any humanitarian thing, largely built around the concept of photo ops. All of the money that we spent required, at least at the minimum, the creation of an English language sign announcing this whatever it was, this barn was built by the United States, or this road was widened by us, or this garbage mound was picked up someplace else and dumped here by us, or whatever. And it got to the point where this was getting to be such a bother to drive around Iraq to these places that we actually seriously considered setting up a bit of a stage set inside of our own fortress so that we didn't have to go out and take these pictures. We would just use an old wall, put up the sign, and we actually had gotten as far as writing up the memos about this. We were going to purchase camels and donkeys. And that's apparently where the idea fell apart, is that the Army said that they weren't going to be responsible for feeding camels and donkeys, and the idea went away. But it was actually considered fairly seriously for a long time. We did a lot of harm in two categories. I'll call them, because this is an academic audience, I have to label things. The first would be subtractive harm. And the second will be what I'll call real harm. Subtractive harm is what we did by not doing things. For example, it was very important that money was spent in the proper way. And so, through some process, it was decided that we needed to dig a well over there. And this was going to help the people of Iraq. The quickest way, of course, to dig a well would be to go out there, round up a handful of unemployed men, which are everywhere in Iraq, and say, dig a hole over here for us, please, and here's a few dollars. The same way some people go into the parking lot at Home Depot and pick up a few folks to help out. But that wasn't how things were to be done. And as part of this process of consuming the NGOs and other organizations, USAID, which was one of the money funnels, would take 100% of the money and would give it to a US-run corporation stationed in Jordan who was set up specifically to take this money. They would skim off 20 or 30% and then pass it on to their counterpart in Iraq, which was, I guess, in Iraq and may or may not have an Iraqi person present, but it was designed then to skim off another 20 or 30% to hire a contractor who would probably go out and hire the 5 guys who were standing around doing nothing near where we needed a hole dug. And by doing this, we managed to make sure that about 90% of the money that we spent never actually got spent on anything that we were doing in Iraq. And some people would argue that's probably for the better, in that when we did spend money, we usually made things worse. So in a way, that may have been a bit of a success. The need for output, as I said, was absolutely critical, and I gave the example of signs, but on the subject of wells, it became very real. We were told that in a particular area we were supposed to dig 50 wells, paid for 50 wells to be dug. I myself did very little digging personally. And we said, okay, great, we're going to go dig 50 wells. And so we went out to the area and said, congratulations, people of Iraq, we're going to give you 50 wells right here on the George Mason campus. And they said, well, the water table here is really shallow. And if you dig 50 wells, none of them are going to have any water in it. You need to dig like 2 wells, and then they'll both flood with water and it'll be happy. So I went back and explained this to my boss, and my boss said, 2 wells is less than 50 wells. No, dig 50 wells. So we went out and we dug 50 wells, and it didn't work. They were all very dry. But because I was a little bit smarter than the average bear, I reserved a little bit of money secretly, and we actually hired guys to go out and fill in 40 of the wells, and thus was an unexpected success, which I did not report to my boss. So that all works out very well. The idea of the 3 Ds is also very striking, because unlike many of my colleagues, I was not at the embassy in Baghdad. I was out in the field embedded with a military unit, actually the 10th Mountain Division, which is made up of people who can walk 24 hours a day. This was a huge challenge for a 52-year-old bureaucrat who did not walk 24 hours a day and live on beef jerky and water. But I adapted. They were nice people, but to them, their idea of using this humanitarian money was literally called money as a weapons system. They actually had a pamphlet that was describing this. And to them, the money was simply another weapon that could be used against the enemy, in this case, the Iraqis. And the planning sessions for using the money were conducted exactly as the planning sessions for using other weapons were conducted. They were called targeting sessions. And you went in and you identified the target. In the morning, we do the lethal targeting, and this is a bridge we're going to blow up. In the afternoon, we do the non-lethal targeting and say, this is a school we're going to rebuild. And it was all based on the same concepts of, here's a problem, how do we solve it, either with artillery or money. One or the other is going to fall on this place, and hopefully things are going to get better. It made it very difficult to actually accomplish anything. What we did accomplish, and now we're into the real harm category, is we created a nation of Tony Sopranos all over Iraq. If you walk into a bar outside of George Mason University and say, hi, I'm incredibly stupid and I've got huge bags of money that I'd like to give away to someone. I mean, could anyone see where that might go wrong for you? And what we did is we created an entire group of people in Iraq who biologically, Darwinian fashion, evolved to take this money from us. And so we ended up enforcing, empowering gangsters, creating new gangsters, and otherwise causing bad things to happen. The unintended consequences were exceptional, and almost the title of my book could have been Unexpected Consequences, and I'll just touch on some of those very quickly. The creating of a very vibrant mafia within Iraq was certainly one of our more significant accomplishments, but they also happened on a much smaller level. We managed to doom local budgeting and government by paying for everything ourselves. If the U.S. government was paying for the trash to be picked up, why should local government figure out actually how to do that? When we stopped paying for the trash to get picked up because we moved on to another target, we actually created a rabies epidemic because the garbage accumulated in such large amounts that the wild dog population exploded. The Iraqi police, who used to shoot wild dogs, realized that when they shot things, especially at night, the Americans would mortar the area. And so they stopped shooting the dogs, the garbage accumulated, and people started dying of rabies. We responded by supplying rabies vaccines in great numbers. One of our most significant unintended consequences came about, again, from the man in the humanitarian system who said, oh, I told us quitting time here in Washington, don't give money to Tony Soprano. Everyone you give money to in Iraq has to be an NGO. Sounded like a good thing in Washington, and certainly was trumpeted widely in the media and things like that. And then what happened is every Tony Soprano then became an NGO. And these guys, these guys would have a fan of name cards. Here's Tony Soprano, Sunni Sheikh, Tony Soprano, contractor, Tony Soprano, NGO. Which one did you need from him on that given day? Better yet, and this is very significant because Chris talks about removing the barriers to economic freedom. One thing would be to eliminate or lessen government restrictions on economic freedom. The tiny little office that was staffed by like 3 old people that licensed NGOs in Baghdad ballooned into hundreds of people, all of whom were raking in millions of dollars in bribes, because suddenly becoming an NGO in Iraq was a very important thing to do and worth a lot of money. So we did all that as part of our great accomplishments there. Chris touches briefly, and he didn't get a chance to mention it in his speaking today, on the fact that the humanitarian workers often bring bad things along with them. We've all seen reports of the UN workers in Africa that participate in the child sex trade, and other places where humanitarians are at least immune from local laws, if not legally immune, in the case of Iraq, where we were diplomatically immune. And I remind you there, quite seriously, of the number of people that were murdered by our security contractors, Blackwater and the other security groups, and more importantly, the trade in human beings that the United States brought along with it to Iraq. We weren't about to wash our own dishes and cook our own food, and we couldn't trust the Iraqis to come onto our military bases and do it for us because they would kill us. And so instead, we imported workers from the third world to do that. All of the cooks and cleaners were Sri Lankans. Anyone who did anything to do with the toilets was Bangladeshi. This all had to do with the recruiter slash pimp slash slaver that was finding these people for us. We had child soldiers from Uganda that came to guard our perimeter. And of course, Filipinas were brought in ostensibly to work at the fast food restaurants, but oftentimes were trafficked in the sexual trade. And this was all part and parcel to the good news that we were bringing. And the results were as predictable as Chris's book would make it seem. And I think anyone who wants to pick up the news and look at what's happening in Iraq today can see what those trillions of dollars actually went into. In closing, which just told me it's time. In closing, I just want to recount very briefly what happened to me because I wrote this book in hopes that George Mason will treat Chris better. 2 years ago, when this book came out, the Department of State began efforts to prosecute me, to put me in jail for writing it, claiming that there was classified material in it. There's not. When they failed at that, they then tried to seize the profits from it, claiming that the interesting things in the book I had learned on government salary, and so I can't write a book about them, as if politicians don't write books about their things. Hillary is working on her memoirs, by the way. They failed at that. They took away my security clearance for linking to a WikiLeaks document on my blog, and then sent people into my life to try to find something to fire me over. And so diplomatic security agents were in my neighborhood asking the neighbors if they ever smelled marijuana or saw unsavory people coming and going. They went through my financial documents. I was called into an office and shown a list of all the websites I had looked at that week from home and asked why I was looking at websites about the Middle East. Duh. My financials were looked at. My credit card statements were on a desk in front of me when I walked in. And I was accused of all these things. They eventually threatened to take me to court for something and keep the game going until I had no money left, basically seeing if they could bankrupt me over the course of all this. When all that started to get to a head, I was very lucky that the American Civil Liberties Union and a group called the Government Accountability Project, as Peter mentioned, came in and were willing to defend me and my First Amendment rights. And so luckily, we negotiated a conclusion to all this where I retired from the State Department and no longer serve the U.S. government. I say that for three reasons. One, of course, I want you all to feel really sorry for me because I lost all my hair in the process, and I feel bad about that. The other, and I used to yell at the dog when I was frustrated. Whoop, but the two reasons, the real two reasons I want to bring that up are number one, to show that there has been some progress in America being willing to think about these things. From a book that practically got me thrown into jail to the point where we can now have a fairly dispassionate academic discussion about whether these things will work or how to do them and things like that. The final thing, of course, is to hope to persuade anybody from George Mason University here not to prosecute Chris for writing his book or go through his financials or try to bankrupt him or anything like that. So I just want to hope that GMU will please give him a break. We're going to be doing this again. This reconstruction business that we've documented has failed time and time and time and time again. We're going to be doing it some more. And so it's very important that people like Chris continue to write these books and you all continue to listen to what he has to say, because if we're going to do this, we could hope at least to do a little less harm the next time, possibly a little more good, and possibly make better use of the taxpayers, your money, when we start spending it in Syria or Libya or the next place. Thank you.
Bob?
10 or
15.
I want to begin my remarks by congratulating Chris on a very good book, and very good in several respects. First of all, he's dealing with an important subject. I'm sure those of you who've been around universities for a while know that many books are not about important subjects. Most, perhaps. This one deals with a very important subject, and it is deeply researched. I'm very impressed by all of the documents and books and articles and relevant materials that Chris has poured over in order to familiarize himself deeply with his subject matter. It is subject matter that is interpreted in a very sound theoretical framework, and that, again, is not something we get from every analysis. We often find people who are willing to dig deeply into the subject materials, but then they make a hash of their interpretation of what's going on. Chris does not do that at all. And finally, the book is a very well written, and as someone who spent much of his life as an editor, I was especially grateful for that. The presentation is clear, precise, and the tone is always just right. It's dispassionate, yet at the same time it packs a punch. So the presentation is excellent. Congratulations, Chris. Very, very well done. Secondly, you may perhaps have very little interest in state-led humanitarian projects. It's not a subject that has occupied me in my research, and so I wasn't sure how much interest I would have when I started reading the book, but I would say that even if you have no interest in humanitarian projects at all, this is a book from which you can learn a great deal because Chris's analysis is general. The book is a kind of handbook for how you would go about studying any government-run program whatsoever, because the analysis that's brought to bear in analyzing and critiquing state-led humanitarian efforts applies in almost every case equally to other government programs. So if you want to understand how the government part of the world works, this is an excellent book to read because you'll learn exactly what you need to know to stop letting people make a fool of you. Now, what does this approach amount to? It involves subsuming several different intellectual or academic traditions, all in one, in Chris's case, seamless set of propositions. The first is public choice analysis. The second is basic Austrian economics, especially with regard to the so-called socialist calculation problem, which is really better called the calculation problem of all non-market activities. And the third is what Chris refers to as the economic way of thinking, and that is what back in my day we called the UCLA Washington price theory. Some other universities were involved in the same basic approach to economics as well, but it's a kind of applied price theory in which you learn very practical, almost incontestable things about how relative prices change actors' actions. And Chris does a great job of bringing this to bear. And the final element is institutional immersion. You can have all the knowledge about public choice theory and Austrian economics and price theory that you could possibly have, yet if you don't understand the actual institutions of a concrete situation, you will be at sea when you go to apply that theory. And Chris deeply immersed himself in the institutions that were relevant to the problem of state-led humanitarian efforts, and as a result, he's come up with very convincing conclusions about the actual incentives and constraints that operated to cause people to do bad, even though they may themselves have often believed they were doing good, at least within the limits of their bureaucratic positions. I have practically nothing critical to say, and so I'm a flop as a discussant in that sense, but there is one element of Chris's book that I could criticize. I'm not going to. I'm actually going to praise it. And that is Chris's rhetoric is beautifully dispassionate, which is to say there are no villains in this book. Now, that's an odd thing considering that this is a book about doing bad. You'd think that people who do bad deserve to be viewed as villains. But as Chris lays out the analysis, the reason they're doing bad is not necessarily that they are bad people, but because the incentives and the constraints of the institutions within which they operate lead them to make certain choices, which, when we stand back and assess, are obviously bad outcomes. particularly in regard to the ostensible aims of these programs. The aim is to alleviate human suffering. Has that been done? Well, you'd think that if you spend 60, 80, 100 billion dollars in one country to alleviate human suffering, you ought to damn well alleviate a lot of human suffering. But did you? Did you actually cause as much as you alleviated? And I think one certainly might argue in Iraq that more was caused than alleviated. In fact, you pick up the daily paper and hardly a day passes that you don't read about some horrible thing happening, hundreds of people being killed in one way or another by disorder and fighting in Iraq. And there's not a situation that always existed in Iraq. This is an outcome of things that were undertaken by the U.S. government, ostensibly for the best of reasons. So there are no villains in Chris's version of this story, and that's good. That's how analysis ought to be done, dispassionately, calmly, without getting embroiled emotionally. I wish I were capable of assessing things that way. Finally, Chris does a good job of laying out a kind of checklist at various points of his analysis, his analytical propositions, and his conclusions. And particularly early in the book, he gives you a preview on pages 20, 21, where he has 10 propositions about the realities of state-led humanitarian action. Now, some of these, as he indicated, relate to the provision of immediate relief when people are starving after an earthquake or they have no water to drink or so forth. Obviously, something beneficial can be done even by the U.S. government. It's not incapable of every single thing we can imagine. So it could haul a plane load of water to some Iraqi city. It's capable of doing that, and that might be a beneficial thing in certain circumstances. But Chris also indicated that when we get beyond the immediate outcomes of some humanitarian disaster, what's at stake here is always whether we are helping to promote longer-term, sustained economic development, because it's only through that process that we bring large groups of people into a position where they will be less likely to suffer and where their material well-being will be enhanced. If we know anything about economic history, we know that. Economic liberty was an essential condition of sustained, substantial economic growth everywhere it's taken place in the world. And sometimes all you had to do was open a little window of economic liberty. Give a Chinese farmer just an inch, and he might take enough of a mile that he would transform rural China. It may not take a lot of economic liberty. We don't have to create laissez-faire societies. We have to give people room to maneuver entrepreneurially without fear that every success they have will be ripped off by the local state agents. So that's what we need to have, and that will give us long-term economic development. Now, when I read Chris's checklist of 10 things, it reminded me of something in my own history, and I'm old enough now that I'm expected to just muse about things in the old days. And so I'll do that here for a few minutes. When I went to teach at the University of Washington in 1968, Doug North, the chairman there, had created a course for himself to teach some years earlier called Economic History and Economic Development, which is a combination of those two areas normally taught separately. And Doug had somehow tired of doing that or had wanted to do other things now, and so he assigned me to teach this course, and I did because I couldn't say no. I did teach it for about 10 years, and then I grew so disillusioned with everything that I'd been myself learning and then passing on to the students from what was called development economics that I pleaded to be relieved from this duty. and was. And at that time, I decided I would write down what I had learned about development economics. And I wrote an article. It's the first thing I ever wrote for non-academic publication, called 10 Rules for Understanding Economic Development. And this was published in the Freeman in March 1978. And so I dug it out the other day and found that there's a lot of correspondence between what Chris writes in his book and what I concluded back in 1977. Some of my rules were the following. Do not conceive of development as solely economic. The incentives that encourage or discourage productivity-raising behavior emerge from the institutional, cultural, and historical environment within which the individuals act. You don't have to be a genius to see that's not the sort of institutional environment an outside power can come in and transform with a wave of its hand, even if the hand is clutching a lot of money. Another rule, do not postulate that economic development is the sole objective of any relevant decision maker. Development economists are always talking about doing this or doing that or adopting this program to promote economic development. But as Peter made clear, the promoters are actually primarily concerned with pleasing their bosses in the bureaucracy, not with economic development. Nobody in the intervening society or in the society they intervene in is primarily interested in economic development. Everybody has interests of his own that are much more focused and personal. Another rule, do not project your own tastes and values onto others. Well, that ought to stop nation building in its tracks right there, okay? Because that's exactly what nation building intrinsically requires, is exactly that projection. Another rule, do not assume that comprehensive governmental programs are necessary to create or accelerate development. Ultimately, the case for comprehensive planning reduces to the simple fact that some, including the planners, wish to coerce others to do what will not be done voluntarily. If people want economic development enough to bear its costs, they voluntarily take the actions that promote it. Forcing somebody to do something for that person's own interest is a contradiction in terms, economically. Another rule, do not assume that governments are impartial and benevolent agencies to promote the public interest. Government officials are not, in general, disinterested humanitarians. More correctly, they are self-interested bureaucrats, politicians, soldiers, and dictators. Governments simply cannot be relied upon to possess superior knowledge, and even if governmental officials did possess superior knowledge, they could not, for obvious reasons, be relied upon to put that knowledge to good use. And finally, which brings me back to the course I had to teach for 10 years, don't forget history. Development economics is a quintessentially historical subject, has been practiced mainly by researchers with neither much knowledge nor interest in history. And that has been practically a disaster for the outcome of their efforts. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have, Chris, did you respond?
Yep.
We have about 25 minutes for questions. I'll field your hand and call on you, but then you direct it at who you want on the panel. So, first question. Hilton.
So the question was about basically a more general point about positive kind of unintended consequences, which which I admit exist as well, and more specifically the Arab Spring emerging from the Iraq invasion. Well, there's two lines of argument. One is to debate whether that's actually has a causal relationship between the two. But even putting that aside, if we were to grant the claim that it's true, that's a odd reason to invade a country, because it might generate revolutions in other countries. There's more cost-effective ways to generate revolutions, but even that aside, that's the point I want to make, and I want to make one point clear. I think I never make the claim in the book, by the way, that aid cannot work and that government intervention can't work. And usually these debates fall prey to that, and I think it's a bad argumentative strategy on both sides, because you can always find a counterexample. And part of the reason I developed it like this, which is really this idea of pattern predictions versus point predictions. I want to make pattern predictions in the book about what we can expect systematically across cases. It's not that you can never find an instance of success, and it was really the result of the nation-building book, because, of course, everyone just started pointing out Germany and Japan and always wanted to talk about that, as if somehow the fact that they could identify two things somehow meant that indefinitely you could just keep doing this over and over again with the same outcome, and it got tiring. But I also realized that we can never make the claim that it can never work. So even if we grant that it did have positive aspects, and there's many others I'm sure you could point out as well, it's not like everyone was made worse off. The point I would respond with is, what gives you confidence that in the future, in other interventions, you can achieve positive benefits? And second of all, what confidence did you have that there are mechanisms of accountability and adaptability so that when bad things happen, people adjust their behaviors accordingly? And when you take into account some of the points I raised and then that were raised by Peter and Bob, I'm very skeptical that there are those mechanisms in place or that they can be designed, since government is fundamentally at odds with designing mechanisms that allow for quick adaptability. It can't be solved through better mechanism design. It's just the inherent problems with government. I don't know if Peter or Bob have something they want to add.
No, I mean, that's all the things. I mean, the idea if I threw this bottle of water at you, I mean, something would happen. Maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing, but to claim that whatever happens is a good reason to throw bottles of water at people, of course, is ridiculous. Germany and Japan are very interesting because the original draft of this book had less sex and less funny stuff in it and was actually a more serious one, and there was actually a chapter talking about Germany and Japan. And in the case of Germany, let's see, but Japan, the reconstruction efforts there were something that I had actually studied quite in depth. And the short version is that there was actually so much to reconstruct that it could be done in Germany and Japan. They were both highly educated, industrialized nations that had long histories of coherency, political stability, strong economies, also all the good stuff that got blown up by the United States, and we just had to put it back together and get out of the way. They stand as very unique examples of reconstruction and have no bearing at all on what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the places we're working on now. And you can't possibly use those examples to make sense out of things, though people will try.
Amen.
John?
So, Chris, I like the general tone of the argument, but if we're to take this argument more cynically, then governments and aid agencies and politicians will do what they want to do. That is, they will continue to want to give money, they will continue to want to intervene, and very often they will want to portray it, say, as doing good, even if their main interest is grandstanding or intervention or whatnot. Given that that's the case, what would you recommend for someone, say, who is in that position, where he's, say, in a position he's being told you have to spend $100 billion, and you know right from the get-go, you're going to be under ridiculous constraints, and you're going to have to waste 90% of it for certain. What is the optimum, least bad thing you can do? Or let me put it this way, what are the guidelines you would come up with to guide someone in that position? It's a little like sort of saying, imagine if the World Bank didn't exist, governments would still step in and do World Bank-like things. So now they make you head of the World Bank, and given that you know it's not going to be done perfectly, and mostly bad, what are the guidelines to help you decide the best way to, in the self-interest of politicians, do more of what you want?
Well, first I would call up Peter and get his voluntary resignation letter for the World Bank position. I resigned from that. But look, this is a hard question because my very position is that I'm not in a position and I have no special knowledge to answer this question about. And one of the things I highlight in the preface is that, because I want to stop readers right away who are expecting this, it's not kind of a step-by-step guidebook for doing humanitarian action right, because I don't think there is a way to do it right. If I was forced into a corner and someone said you have to do it or else, this would be my guidelines. Every step you take should be to remove a barrier to exchange. In other words, the movement from subsistence to exchange, as P.T. Bauer called it, is ultimately the linchpin of economic development. And if we're going to spend that 10% that's not wasted, let's spend it on removing some barriers to or regulations that prevent people from interacting with each other. And so that would be my guiding principle. In terms of what specific things within that, I don't know. That would be very context specific and very dependent, so that's harder to answer. So I know that doesn't answer your question as concretely as maybe you would have liked or as other people might be able to answer it, but that would kind of be my guiding principle, that the best I can offer.
I'm chuckling because I have a lot of ways that I could spend that 90%, starting with mandatory economics taught from the perspective that I follow throughout all of the country, because economic literacy will raise.
Pete's self-interested, he just wants to sell copies of his textbook.
Yeah. Economic literacy requires all, K through whatever. All right.
My question, I can't get an answer to it from anyone, so I'm going to put it to you, Chris, or Peter, or Bob. But it seems like an obvious question. I think it's asked too infrequently. People on our side, generally, on the market-oriented side, often understand that government misfires when it's applied to domestic issues, but lose that insight when we go abroad. I'm thinking particularly of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the people at the American Economic Association, AEI, American Enterprise Institute. There's no foreign intervention that America can't cure. Why is it that they believe that politicians are venal, self-interested, incurably political, and ignorant when dealing with domestic problems, but selfless, highly intelligent, upstanding, almost godlike when dealing abroad? Do you have any insight for why there's this disconnect among so many people in the broadly considered free market side?
Bob, do you have any insight?
I don't know if it's much of an insight. The distinction you described there, Don, is part of a broader divide between conservatives and libertarians. And I've been banging my head against free market conservatives, at least since 1968, who didn't share my libertarian views about foreign policy and defense policy in particular. And there are other lines along which those two groups divide systematically as well, reliably. And I think part of it just has to do with the fact that conservatives do not have a general presumption against the state per se in the same way that libertarians do. Libertarians are defined, if they're defined by anything, by extreme suspicion of the state. For some of us, suspicion so strong that we want to get rid of the damn thing. But at least all libertarians, even softcore ones, are extremely suspicious of the state. If it's going to do something, they're suspicious. Conservatives are not like that. Conservatives are much more focused on this particular end that the government purports to be seeking. If it's seeking to pound us into virtue domestically through laws against drug use or all sorts of other so-called moral questions, they're all for it. If it purports to be pounding the Iraqis into peaceful and civilized and democratic ways of life, they're all for it. And they, as you say, they forget everything they say analytically when they're criticizing the Department of Health and Human Welfare. They think the DOD is not a giant bureaucracy with tons of money and discretion. But that's just blindness, in my view. They just don't want to open their eyes to reality. These big bureaucracies all, strangely enough, act like big bureaucracies.
There's this odd sense, and it may not be unique to Americans, but it's certainly very much a part of our character to want to be liked overseas, and want to be liked by people. And it's a very easy story to sell. Part of my job in Iraq and actually throughout my career was to sell that story. And it's very easy. We had a project where we were encouraging Iraqis to grow rabbits, which they ate. And this got some media attention. We got a letter from someone in Idaho or something saying, "I love my country. Other countries do these terrible things, and my country gives away bunnies." And this is the story that we want to believe about ourselves. That you know, in occupied France, they run out and give us bottles of wine and, you know, hoist their daughters onto our tanks, and we give out candy and things like that. And this is the image that people want to believe about themselves, about the United States abroad, and it's an easy story to sell, and the media is very happy to pick up on that. At the same time, the media is unskilled and often loath to talk about serious problems and issues. One of the things that it struck me when the State Department was trying to prosecute me over alleged classified material is how remarkably unclassified everything here was. Everything that I saw and experienced, and some of which I told you about here, was happening right out in front of everyone. I had no access to this didn't come from secret documents or you know, dark cornered meetings. This was what we were doing very openly. And yet nobody seemed to want to talk about it. Everyone wanted to focus on the good news, and we want to be liked, and we'll buy that story easily.
This is a very good question, Don. It's something that I've thought about for a while. I mean, even some of our colleagues, you know, I have a funny story, Pete Leeson and Pete Boettke were there for this. Gordon Tullock would always, when I was a grad student, would always bring up something that happened in China long ago that I had no clue about, of a successful intervention, in response to me. And then I'd say, I don't know about that, and he'd say, well, you should go read a book about it. And it was always a successful intervention. But the last time I finally had a good response, which is I did read a good book. It's called The Collected Works of Gordon Tullock. So why do you support this? But here's what I think the deeper thing is for the kind of, I call it the conservative two-step. It's domestically government. The government can't run the post office, but internationally we confer like magical powers upon them to reshape the world. I think really what it's come down to, my interaction with people who hold this position, is this idea of American exceptionalism, that we have a unique set of values and traditions that no one else has, and that it's part of our duty to share them with the rest of the world, and not just to share them, but in some sense to impose them upon them. Pete Leeson and I had lunch with someone just a couple weeks ago who's a conservative domestically, but very pro-nation building abroad. And I said to him, doesn't the Haiti disaster force you to call into question everything that you hold about this? And he said, no, not at all. In fact, it makes it stronger. And I said, what do you mean? He said, the problem in Haiti isn't that we intervened, it's that we weren't strong enough. What we should have done, we gave them too much choice. We should have set up a military protectorate and said, we're in charge and we will leave when we want to leave, when you have adopted the institutions and the values that we want to leave. In other words, colonization, basically. And when it comes down to that, it's tough to respond because they don't want to hear about public choice arguments. It's just more force, basically, which is true. If you raise the cost of something enough, people will get it. It's just very brutal and costly in terms of respecting other human beings. So I don't have an easy answer to it, but it is a systematic problem, it seems, for many conservatives.
Mark? So my question is related to that. So do you think it's the case that in all cases and in all times, the inability of governments to do humanitarian action is the same? We always face the same constraints? Or have there been other examples of some countries or societies which have been able to do it better than other countries? And what I have in the back of my mind is kind of, say I was a conservative in favor of this kind of stuff, I could say, look, the British Empire or the Roman Empire, they did like humanitarian action or state building well. It's just the US can't do it now, and that's because of, I don't know, they're not tough enough or some other constraint that they haven't got right. So yes, they messed up Iraq, but they can do it better if only they change their ways.
This is like Ferguson's argument, right?
Yeah,
The U.S. should be
exactly,
more like
yeah.
the British Empire. Yeah, two things that come to mind when I hear these arguments. The first is they usually try to provide either a monocausal or very few kind of causal mechanisms of what we need to do differently, and then things would be different. We get a different outcome if just we did this differently. I'm not convinced that it's that simple, that we can actually identify actually what causes development, let alone exporting these things. I'm going to borrow a line from John here, right? One of my favorite John Nye papers is the entrepreneurship, the idea of lucky fools. I think a lot of success cases that we identify are just instances of lucky fools. It's that if you try stuff enough, it's going to work sometimes, right? And people that don't know what they're doing, or they're responding to the incentives, or they're just focused on outputs, it's going to work out for them, and then you can point to that as a case of success. But again, the issue comes down to how confident are you that we can replicate that across instances of human suffering. And when we start talking in those terms of broad patterns instead of individual cases, I think, at least for me, I'm highly skeptical.
I also, to follow up on Mark's question, a lot of, and this is also Tulloch's position, which is a lot has changed in what we're willing to explicitly tolerate in our efforts, right? Part of the Ferguson or Deepak Lal or whatever their position is that we should have a little bit more confidence in, because of our exceptionalism, to be able to go in and actually do things that we would have moral qualms about doing. Whereas when it was the British Empire or the Roman Empire, I didn't really have those qualms, right? I just went in and did it. And I tend to think, even like on any of these questions, you know, of course, if you go in and annihilate the indigenous population and then put in your institutions and populate it with people that fit there, you can get a miracle going. But, you know, are we going to advocate that? Now, Gordon Tulloch was willing to bite the bullet and say, yep, right, that's, so, you know, I mean, but like, you know, he would say, yeah, that's okay, we can do that. I mean, he would say that at least in being facetious in a conversation and push you on it. But I'm wondering how much of that runs into your issue, whereas what you're doing is demonstrating that we are actually generating results which are at odds with our rhetoric about our concern for the least advantage in these other places.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, look, but even going back to the British Empire, Adam Smith didn't think it was a net benefit. He made a strong argument against it, but John Stuart Mill made very strong arguments for a stronger British Empire to raise the savages up and civilize them. So this classical liberal debate, in some sense, that you bring up has a long history. But yeah, Pete, you're right. But I don't know. It's unclear to me, given our political institutions today, by the way, that we could replicate Britain, even if we knew that that was somehow the solution, or another empire that was successful. Just the way our political system's set up, for instance. So for instance, when Ferguson talks about this, he says one of the problems we run into is that U.S. voters don't want to leave troops abroad, right, in one area for a significant period of time, which is required for colonization. He makes the argument that we should colonize certain weak and failed states and just leave them there until it's determined that we're ready to bring home the military protectorate. And it's unclear politically that you could do that. And then, of course, you put on top of it these public choice issues, and it's unclear as well. Then you layer on what it would require in terms of brutality, and we have empirical evidence of that, of course, from colonization efforts, and oftentimes just brutal behaviors in order to keep people in line and get them to do what you want to do, and then it becomes even more difficult.
All the way in the back, Sam?
Yeah, Chris, you said that the burden of proof ought to be on people who propose the intervention. I would argue that the median elite and probably the median voter disagrees with that. It seems to me that the real argument is over this specific point. Do you have any proposals for winning that argument?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I understood the first part, but...
So the average policymaker, person in Washington, does not, in my opinion, does not believe that the burden of proof should be on the one recommending the intervention. It should be on the person who opposes it.
Sure, but it's not even the median policymaker, it's economists, right? Paul Collier, for instance, holds this position, right? If you're a skeptic, you never do anything, and then people suffer. So lots of academics hold this position as well. I mean, if you make my view in general is if you make a strong claim, and which is what proponents of interventions do. Again, they never say things like, at least rhetorically, we can deliver water to people. It's always very grandiose claims. It seems that we should be able to say, well, what evidence do you have? What responsibility do you have if the policy fails? In other words, are you going to be penalized? Because we want to internalize the costs of bad policies. What mechanisms of accountability are there? And of course, as our colleagues here at George Mason, like Brian Kaplan and others have pointed out, in democracies, at least the way our system's set up, those mechanisms are oftentimes lacking. So am I ever going to convince a policymaker of this, that the burden should be on them? Probably not. And even if I did, the response in terms of supporting or in terms of responding to that burden would just be empty promises of grandiose things. And look, rhetorically it's a difficult position, because when I typically am in other audiences, the discussion goes like this. Would you intervene in Syria? No. What if they use chemical weapons? No. So you're okay with them using chemical weapons. Now what am I? Am I either like using chemical weapons, like it's like, when did you stop beating your wife kind of thing?
With us or against us?
Yeah, and so rhetorically, it's a very difficult position that I'm in, because it's very easy to force me into a position which I believe, but which also makes me look like I don't care about people. So I don't have a simple answer. I wish I did, but there's definitely work to be done in that area, at least conceptually.
Absent a simple answer, though, we have the tragic results that are playing out as we speak. We didn't ask those questions before we invaded Iraq. We aren't asking those questions about why we're still in Afghanistan 12 years on and planning to stay longer. We didn't ask those questions before we set off a conflagration across northern Africa in Libya. By not holding the people who make the decisions responsible, the results are fairly obvious and terribly tragic. And that's the practical boundaries of it.
I think if you wanted to reduce all of these considerations to a single question, you'd ask, who will be punished when things go wrong? And that is the decisive difference between actions in the market and actions undertaken by governments. In the market, when your investment decisions go wrong, you lose wealth. You are punished. The decision maker is punished for going wrong. The laborer who moves to the wrong labor market is punished by a lower wage or by no earnings at all, and so forth. In government, failure is normally not only not punished, it is actually rewarded, because the decision maker comes back and says, you know, this isn't, you know, going well, we need more money, we need more staff to get the job done. Those arguments are made every single year in budget time here. And they work year after year after year. The people who screw up the worst are often rewarded the most. Well, what do you expect when that's the nature of your system? When no one is really punished for messing up other people's lives, you'll expect a whole lot of people running out to mess up other people's lives. It's almost a definition of government. Now, of course, if you put it like that, it wouldn't sell, because you got the masses out there being looted to pay for the whole thing. So you got to clothe it in this costume that it's all for a good purpose. It's all for doing well. It's all for saving people from disaster. It's all for helping the poor and the dispossessed and the destitute and all the rest of the ne'er-do-wells. Okay? It's all for something good. And that's why we're ripping you off with tax money and putting you in debt to the generation in the future. It's all for a good purpose. But if we happen to be wrong, we won't be punished for that. In fact, we'll be long gone by the time anybody ever thinks that we deserve punishment. So what a system is that? That's a system calculated for enormous disasters here, there, and everywhere. That's what we've seen in humanitarian efforts. Disasters here, there, and everywhere, notwithstanding a handful of cases where, yeah, we truck in a plane load of water. What does that amount to in the big picture? Nothing. So we've got a system here when you say, who gets punished for screwing up? And the answer is all wrong when the government undertakes these actions. Because government actors almost never get punished. The only time they get punished is when maybe they lose a world war and they have to go shoot themselves in the head in a bunker. So finally somebody gets punished, but it's pretty late in the game. Okay? We'd like a system that doesn't require us to go to those extremes in order to finally punish somebody who's responsible for the foul-up.
In my chain of command, the people who were responsible for the things that I was describing to you, my boss retired from the State Department and was hired as a six-figure contractor by the Army to help reconstruct Afghanistan. His boss was promoted to an assistant secretary's position. His boss, she became an ambassador. Her boss is now our ambassador to Syria, and the ambassador to Iraq at the time who oversaw all this is the dean of the Corbell School of Diplomacy at the University of Colorado. And his boss, Hillary Clinton, will probably be the next president of the United States. So in terms of accountability, there remain some questions.
We have time for one more question, and the panel's response. Virgil?
So Chris, in your presentation in the book, you're very careful to sort of say you're speaking about state-led humanitarian efforts. And I guess my question is, how much do the arguments that you make against state-led humanitarian efforts cut against sort of large private humanitarian efforts like, you know, Gates Foundation, the Red Cross to the extent it's not funded by government, Bono's Foundation, and these kinds of things? And if they don't cut against them, why don't they cut against them? And if they do, then is the takeaway that there's nothing that we in the West can do to help people in the rest of the world that we should be like confident would help people in the rest of the world?
So when in the case where NGOs are funded by government, I make the argument that they basically become arms of the government and become subject to the same problems, bureaucracy, all that. Independent NGOs I don't touch upon too much, even though I make the passing claim, and I think I said this during my talk, that a lot of the same arguments apply. So what would this mean for a purely non-governmental organization? By purely, I mean that they're not linked in with government somehow, which is very rare now. Especially at the larger scale. They still can't gauge in economic calculation, and what they can do is short-term relief. So what are some examples of this? Well, the stuff you've done with Emily Chamley Wright following Hurricane Katrina, where a local church helped people rebuild their house, or they helped deliver food and water to people in need or health care. Those are the type of things that can happen, and I would argue tend to be more effective because they have to raise their own funds, but also they have to rely and they have access to local knowledge. Those things aren't attractive to people in government because they're too small scale. That doesn't stand out doing something like that. That said, we also will tend to observe, given my general framework, lots of waste in NGOs, precisely because they are not subject to the same constraints as Bob was pointing out that market participants are. So NGOs, nonprofits, they're not a solution to poverty, right, as Bono and Bill Gates want to argue. Can they do nothing? No, of course not. But really, the main takeaway I view it is that we should be agitating for trade, for free interaction between people, trade in the broadest sense, not just goods and services, but the free movement of people, and letting people figure out what they want to do and then letting them do it within a set of institutional constraints. Again, we can't control what other governments do necessarily, but we can control domestically what we do to some extent. And that's ultimately where it leaves us. So I'm skeptical. After writing the book, I'm skeptical of NGOs. Lots of libertarian types like to point out that NGOs are good because they're private. They are private, and it's fine, but they're not a solution to the fundamental problems of solving societal-wide poverty.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Bob, Peter, and Chris